So the second exam is on the endocrine system and reproductive systems, including both male and female. So at the beginning of the endocrine system, we talked about how the big boss is the hypothalamus, and that communicates with the pituitary. We talked about the differences between the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Remember, the posterior pituitary is just storage. It's storing ADH and oxytocin. And the way that the hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary is through a neural network. So when it gets word that, let's say, ADH needs to be released, then it sends a message by way of that neural network to the posterior pituitary to release ADH. The communication with the anterior pituitary is a little different. That's through that portal system, so the bloodstream. And the hypothalamus makes 8 hormones. So 2 are going to be stored in the posterior pituitary. 6 are going to be those inhibiting releasing hormones. So when it gets word that one of those anterior pituitary hormones needs to be released, it will send down one of those releasing hormones that communicates with the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. Now, anterior pituitary has several hormones, and we talked about the difference between a tropic and non-tropic hormone. A tropic hormone is going to talk to other glands. So, for example, an example of that would be TSH. And so TSH would then communicate with the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. Non-tropic hormones, they are going to talk to cells directly. So we also went through some of the different glands as well. So we went through the thyroid, pineal, parathyroid, adrenal, and pancreas. So you should know the hormones for the posterior and anterior pituitary. I gave you that little mnemonic for the anterior pituitary, flat peg. The flat hormones, those are the tropic hormones. The peg hormones, those are non-tropic. You should also know where the hormones are coming from, as well as their function. So one of the things that I put in here is a little summary slide of those posterior and anterior pituitary hormones. You can also see sort of the flow. So remember, it's the hypothalamus, then communicating with the pituitary, then we're talking about the targets and the effects. So here, this table has listed out those posterior pituitary hormones and the anterior pituitary hormones. Now, I told you that I'm not going to hold you to knowing those releasing, inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus, but you can see that they're right here, even though we did talk about a couple of those, not only in this chapter, but in the reproductive chapters as well. So hopefully this table will help you to organize the differences between the posterior and anterior pituitary. This table also lists the other glands, their hormones, and their functions. One of the assignments or handouts that I gave you was a table just so that you could summarize the glands, the hormones, and the functions. Hopefully this table will also help you with that as well. So there is the matching game that I posted on Blackboard that can help you if you like flashcards, if you like to draw things out, write things out. I always say that if you can explain it, then you know it. So if you can go through all of these glands and talk about the hormones and talk about the functions, you should be in good shape. It's not like you need to write an essay on each of these functions. This is just kind of general overview of functions. The other thing that we talked about with the hormones is that depending on their chemistry, they're going to have different characteristics. So we talked about hydrophilic hormones versus hydrophobic hormones. So I gave you another term that also means hydrophobic, and that's lipophilic. So remember, they're going to be non-polar, where hydrophilic, they're going to be polar, they're going to be like water. So hydrophilic means water loving, hydrophobic means water fearing. Lipophilic means the same thing as hydrophobic. So we talked about how hydrophobic hormones, because they are not going to be compatible with the water in the bloodstream, they're going to need those transport proteins, those albumins, to help carry them around. Because those proteins are going to protect them from some of those dangerous enzymes in the kidney and liver, they tend to have a longer half-life. They're going to hang around for a little longer because they're a little more protected. Now, where they are located, their receptors are located, is going to be inside the cell. Because if you remember the plasma membrane, that phospholipid bilayer, only small nonpolar molecules can fit through. So those hydrophobic hormones, so those steroid hormones like estrogen, cortisol, testosterone, they can sneak through that plasma membrane. So their receptors are in the nucleus, in fact, very close to DNA. Now, it sometimes can take a little longer to feel their effects, because if you remember learning about protein synthesis, going through transcription, going through translation, that can be a lengthy process. Then we talked about hydrophilic hormones. So because they're going to be very compatible with the water in the bloodstream, they travel freely in blood. Because they can't get through that plasma membrane, their receptors are on the cell membrane. So they need some messengers to get their information to the DNA. So they're going to use that secondary messenger communication. Now, I'm not going to hold you to knowing that G protein cascade that we saw in class, but you should know that hydrophilic hormones communicate with the cell by way of that secondary messenger system. So that primary messenger is the hormone that binds to the receptor. Then we kick off this whole cascade of reaction, and that finally gets that message into the cell. Because of that, we can have an amplified effect. So I often compare cyclic AMP to being the Karen of the cell. If you get a lot of Karens running around the store, a lot is going to happen, right? We're going to have a big reaction. So it takes very little hormone to actually have a big effect. Now, hydrophilic hormones, they're going to be things like proteins like insulin. So you should know the difference. This is definitely one of those questions that you can practice writing out. So how they travel in blood, where their receptors are, how they communicate in cells, as well as examples of each of those. Now, if you're a visual person, I included this picture. So this is a little summary where you can see side by side that communication between hydrophilic and hydrophobic hormones. So if you like to draw, this might be a good little practice. If you can sit with these pictures and you can explain what's happening, so how they travel in blood, where their receptors are, how they're communicating, then you're going to be in pretty good shape. So I put this picture in to help you with that process. Now, another thing that we talked about in the endocrine system, we talked about some different disorders. So we talked about hyposecretion situations and hypersecretion. Hyper means above, producing more. Hypo means under, producing less. So I talked about some thyroid disorders. So we talked about hyperthyroidism. We also talked about hypothyroidism. So what I put up here at the top, this is that communication between the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and the glands. So for the thyroid, hypothalamus releases thyroid releasing hormone. That goes down that bloodstream to communicate with the anterior pituitary to tell the anterior pituitary to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Then thyroid stimulating hormone communicates with the thyroid to produce more T4 and T3. And we talked about how this helps with metabolism. So we went through a couple of situations. So one had to do with less secretion of T4 and T3. So somebody that is suffering from hypothyroidism, they would have a very low amount of T4 and T3. So you can imagine what their symptoms would be. They would be very lethargic, not a lot of energy. They might be gaining weight. So their metabolism just isn't where it should be. Now, as a clinician, if you were to take blood work, of course, you would see low T4 and T3, but you would actually see high TSH. The reason for that is because the hypothalamus is getting word that the thyroid isn't producing enough T4 and T3. So it keeps telling the anterior pituitary to continue to secrete TSH. So because of that feedback system, we would actually see a high TSH. So for whatever reason, the thyroid just is not producing enough of that thyroid hormone. Now, this can be due to a number of things. People can be born with that. As we get older and the warranty starts to run out, we might not be able to produce as much. Perhaps maybe somebody has like an iodine deficiency. That could be an issue. I also talked about an autoimmune disease where a person's autoantibodies destroys those cells that make T4 and T3 and they're not able to produce it. And I talked about that as being Hashimoto's disease. Now, the opposite of this is hyperthyroidism. So this is when somebody is producing too much thyroid hormone. So think about what their symptoms could be. They'd have difficulty regulating their temperature, probably heart rate, metabolism is going to be off the charts. They're going to be hungry and they could actually be losing weight. Now, if we were to take their blood work, we would notice a high T4, T3 level, but we would see a low TSH level. The reason for that is feedback again, because the hypothalamus is getting the message that there's a lot of T4 and T3. There's no reason to communicate with the anterior pituitary to release more TSH. So I mentioned this with Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disorder. In this case, those autoantibodies are mimicking TSH and keep hitting the thyroid to make more T4 and T3. And so their metabolism is going to be off the charts. In either case, a person is going to have thyroid medication to actually regulate this. So that's a disorder or a couple of disorders that have to do with the thyroid. We also talked about disorder that has to do with insulin, and this is diabetes mellitus. Now, remember that diabetes has to do with fluid. It has to do with the water. So somebody that has diabetes mellitus, some of their first symptoms could be that they're constantly running to the bathroom and then constantly thirsty. So it's this vicious cycle. That's because their kidneys are trying to grab that extra glucose, but they can't possibly bring it all back into the body. So when the glucose leaves, the water follows it. So that's actually where we get that term diabetes. Now, diabetes mellitus, this has to do with insulin. It also has to do with the cells getting glucose. So with diabetes mellitus, these cells are either insulin resistant, where it takes a lot of insulin to have a reaction, or the body just is not making enough insulin. So what happens is, as a consequence, the cells aren't getting the glucose, the cells are starving. Now, somebody doesn't have enough energy, they're probably going to be very tired. If we were to take their blood work, their blood glucose levels would be off the chart. So we talked about the job of insulin. So insulin basically has two jobs. The first is to unlock the door to allow glucose to enter into the cell. And the other part is to take all of that glucose, gather it up, and put it in the cupboard for a rainy day to make that polysaccharide glycogen. So those are the two jobs of insulin. Now, there's two different types of diabetes mellitus. There is type 1. This is an autoimmune disorder where the person has a virus and they clear the virus. However, those viral antigens are very similar to the beta cells in the pancreas that produce insulin. So the immune system thinks those beta cells are the virus, attacks them, and blows out that part of the pancreas. People with type 1 diabetes mellitus, they're going to be insulin dependent because they just can't make enough insulin. Type 2, there's a variety of different risk factors. And there could also be a variety of treatments as well. So this is when the cells are insulin resistant. So if those cells are constantly bombarded with insulin, they're eventually going to start to downregulate those receptors. So now they're not going to be as sensitive. So the body's going to have to keep producing more and more insulin. It gets harder and harder to get the glucose into the cells. So people with type 2 diabetes mellitus, they could have some different treatments where maybe diet and exercise is going to be enough to work. Perhaps they might have to go on some sort of drug, or perhaps they might end up using insulin. So this is diabetes mellitus. So again, if you're having difficulty trying to distinguish between type 1 and type 2, you may want to describe it. You may want to write it out just so that you know the difference. So that is another disorder. Another diabetes disorder that we talked about doesn't have to do with glucose. This has to do with ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So remember that diabetes, that has to do with that fluid imbalance. So for whatever reason, if somebody is lacking antidiuretic hormone, they're not able to hold that water in. So they're going to have similar symptoms where they're frequently urinating and then they're dying of thirst. So they're getting dehydrated. So it's this vicious cycle. So it may appear as diabetes mellitus, but a quick check of their blood glucose levels can tell us whether or not it's diabetes mellitus or diabetes insipidus. If their blood glucose levels are fine, then we might suspect diabetes insipidus instead, and we might want to investigate the levels of antidiuretic hormone. So that was another disorder that has to do with that fluid balance. And that's why they both have that first term as diabetes. All right, so that was the endocrine system. Now, for the reproductive systems, we started off with a cell division process, which we find in both males and females. And this is meiosis. Now, meiosis is a cell division process like mitosis. Mitosis happens in somatic cells, body cells, basically cells that aren't sex cells or gametes, egg and sperm. So we saw some similarities, but there were definitely some differences. First of all, we call meiosis 1, and there are 2 divisions of meiosis, so that is one difference. But we call meiosis 1 a reduction division. The reason for that is that we're reducing the number of chromosomes and dividing the cell. So we go from being diploid to haploid. If you remember in mitosis, we start with diploid cells, we end with diploid cells. So if we are replicating skin cells, we want to make sure that they're identical. In meiosis, those daughter cells are not going to be identical. So we talked about meiosis 1 as being reduction division process and all of that fancy stuff that is happening. So with meiosis 1, we're seeing the same types of things: prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1. However, we talked about some different terms that we would hear. So with meiosis 1, we talk about homologous chromosomes, and that means that they're 2 of the same. And we talked about the process of synapsis. This is when homologous chromosomes find each other. Chromosome 18 finds chromosome 18, and they sit next to each other. Now, it's possible that crossing over can happen. This is when these homologous chromosomes can exchange material. Now, these are like alleles. This is something like exchanging free earlobes for attached earlobes. This is not like exchanging eyes for ears. We don't want to lose any genetic information. The other thing that we talked about is independent assortment. So as we're ready to split these homologous chromosomes in metaphase 1, they're going to line up on the middle of the cell, the equatorial plane, in a random order. So that just kind of adds to that genetic diversity. So in meiosis 1, we have all of this fancy stuff happening, which helps us increase our genetic diversity so that we're not clones of our siblings. Now, meiosis 2, even though we're looking at 2 cells, if you look at that bottom picture, This is very similar to mitosis. We start with haploid cells, we end with haploid cells. We're not talking about some of that special terminology like homologous chromosomes. We usually talk about chromatids in meiosis II. We don't talk about synapsis, crossing over, or independent assortment. Now, what we end up with are 4 haploid cells. Now, when we got to the male and female reproductive systems, we talked about how in males, it's spermatogenesis, and it looks very similar to what we mapped out with meiosis, where we end up with 4 spermatids. That is spermatogenesis. Then, as they kind of undergo that transformation to that tadpole looking structure, that's spermiogenesis. In females, it's oogenesis. Now, that was a little different because we end up with 1 egg, and then we end up with those 3 chromosomal casts off, those 3 polar bodies. Which one is chosen is just sort of at random. Now, another thing that we talked about with meiosis is that in spermatogenesis, males don't start producing sperm until puberty. In females, they're born with all of the eggs that they will ever have. We also talked about it being more of a cyclical pattern with females. So this is where we started with the reproductive systems. Then we got into the male reproductive system. We talked about spermatogenesis and that meiosis, and spermiogenesis, those spermatids forming into those mature spermatozoan. We also brought in our hormones. So we talked about FSH and LH. We also talked about those different cells, the sustentacular and interstitial cells. We also talked about that blood testis barrier to hide these cells from the immune system, because this is when those cells look a little different, and we don't want the immune system to start attacking them, thinking that they're a foreign invader. The other thing that we talked about were the accessory glands. So we talked about the prostate, seminal vesicles, and Cowper's glands. We talked about 2 requirements of fertilization and sperm is that they need a higher pH. So some of the fluids from those accessory glands help with that, and also to nourish them, to make sure that they've got enough energy to make their trip to that egg. So we talked about some of those different components of the male reproductive system. With the female reproductive system, I promised you a layer of an onion, and we started to peel back that layer. We talked about the different hormones. Again, we brought in FSH and LH. This time we talked about estrogen and progesterone. And with that layer of the onion, we talked about not only the hormones, but we talked about the events in the ovaries. So we talked about oogenesis, the follicular phase, then ovulation, then the luteal phase. So this was more of a cyclical pattern based on a 28-day cycle. Now, with this 28-day cycle, we had this feedback system with the hormones. So that was sort of governing all of these changes. Not only did we see changes in the ovaries, but then we also saw changes in the uterus. So we talked about the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, secretory phase, and premenstrual phase. So this is the little feedback. And one of the worksheets that we worked on, we talked about the different functions of these hormones, FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone. But on the bottom of the worksheet, we had sort of this figure 8 with this feedback system. So this is a little simplification of that feedback system. So the hypothalamus is going to release GnRH, which then speaks to the anterior pituitary that is releasing LH and FSH, which is talking to the ovary. Now the ovaries, the follicles, are going to be releasing estrogen and progesterone. So as estrogen and progesterone rise, because as that follicle develops, that egg is released, then we're going to be in sort of a holding pattern, waiting for that egg to be fertilized. So estrogen and progesterone feed back to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary saying, hold on, let's see if this egg is going to get fertilized. So that's going to suppress LH and FSH. If fertilization doesn't happen, then we're going to start that phase all over again. So we talked about those events in the ovary. We also have those events in the uterus that also parallel this. So this is a very simplistic version of that feedback system, just to kind of help you with that, that figure 8 pattern that we looked at with that worksheet. All right, here are the layers of the onion. So remember, if you can sit with this picture and understand why we're seeing a rise in estrogen and progesterone, why we're seeing a rise in FSH and LH, the events of the ovaries, the events of the uterus, you're going to be in good shape. If you want to draw this out, if you can speak from this picture, write it out. That will help. So I wasn't kidding about the layers of the onion. So remember, it's going to start with the hormones coming from the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, right? They're kind of governing this. So in the first about 13 days, we've got FSH on the rise, and you notice that we also have LH. This is what is recruiting those follicles, right? So in the ovaries, those follicles are starting to mature. Now, what we're seeing on the next level with the ovarian hormone levels is that as those follicles mature, estrogen is now on the rise, and that's starting to feed back to the hypothalamus. Now, what we're seeing in the uterus at the very beginning, this is when we're starting over again. So the menstrual phase is actually first, even though in many textbooks we see it as last. We're kind of getting ready because we're waiting to see if that egg is going to get fertilized. As that follicle matures, as estrogen starts to increase, now we're building up that uterine layer, and now we're in that proliferative phase. Now, as that follicle matures, that one Graafian follicle, which is most sensitive to FSH, is secreting that estrogen. So notice that right before day 14, estrogen is peaking. That's feeding back to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, and we're getting a surge of LH. That surge of LH causes ovulation. So if you can see on day 14, we've got the egg popping out. Now the egg is going to start to travel. Now in the ovary, we're going into the luteal phase. This is when the follicle turns into the corpus luteum and it's secreting progesterone. Progesterone's job is to build up that endometrial lining because there could be a fertilized egg that needs a soft, cushy place to land. So you can see that progesterone starts to rise. As progesterone is at its highest, this is the secretory phase. So this is when that uterine lining is going to be at its thickest because there could be a fertilized egg. Now, if fertilization doesn't happen, corpus luteum withers away to be the corpus albicans. Notice progesterone, estrogen start to decline. That's feeding back to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Now we're going to start the cycle all over again where we're ramping up FSH, recruiting our next batch of follicles. So if you can sit with this picture, either explain it, write it out so that you can see what's going on in each one of these layers, you're going to be in good shape. Now, the last thing has to do with what if the egg is fertilized? What if it isn't? So if pregnancy does not occur, this means that the egg has not been fertilized. So what happens to the corpus luteum is that it starts to shrink. This is what we call involution. And then it becomes this scar tissue, this corpus albicans. So it's no longer secreting that progesterone and estrogen. That's feeding back to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. So then FSH levels are going to start to rise, and we're going to start this cycle all over again. Now, if pregnancy occurs, the egg is fertilized, that developing embryo produces human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. This is what they test in pregnancy tests. This keeps that corpus luteum alive, so it continues to secrete progesterone to maintain that endometrial lining. Now we're in a new ball game because now we're into pregnancy, the reproductive cycle. So you should know what happens in either case. This is another one of those that you can either explain it or you can write it down. So there's lots of things to practice with as you get ready for this exam, especially with the hormones. You can use flashcards, you can use the matching game to help you get ready for the exam.